So let's talk about how changes in technology, or forensic technology, can lead to drastic changes in the outcome of a particular case. And in this case, we're going to talk about BTK. BTK was a serial killer from the 70s through the 90s in America, in a small town small city called Wichita in Kansas. So changes in technology. Let's talk about what happens. Basically, as we said, it's altered the outcomes of various forensic investigations. Until the 1980s, for example, there were only 3 types of bodily fluid analysis available. Identifying if it's blood by using ninhydrin, so we could say that blood was somebody sprayed ninhydrin on it and it all turns purple. You could see if it's human or animal blood, but you actually needed quite a bit of it to do this, and you could identify the blood group. Now, this is if we're using bodily fluids other than blood, so semen, saliva, whatnot, fecal matter. This is actually only possible with about 80% of the population. There are 20% of the population who we would call non-secretors. Non-secretors are people who do not secrete the antigens. That's what makes your blood type. Don't secrete their antigens in anything but red blood. And that includes white blood cells. Now, on top of this, there have been advances in genetic technology. And this has allowed forensic chemists to give genetic profiles of victims and suspects. Just quickly while we're at it, a lot of people see geneticists, such as I used to be, as biologists. But what you'll find is that quite a lot of geneticists, in particular your molecular geneticists, which is my area, are in fact biochemists as opposed to biologists. You're really much more dealing with chemistry. Also, they can give genetic profiles of victims or suspects, and both of these are really important. We want to be able to identify a victim if we have only a small amount of remains. It also allows you to differ between people with the same blood group and with any bodily fluid. Now, this is a new thing up until the mid-80s, and in a legal sense, you couldn't really even use it until the mid-90s. You couldn't differ between people you couldn't use your DNA to make your profiles, but you could also only use your DNA to really, or your blood, to work out what blood group someone was. And, if it's one type of blood group, that might be 25% of the population. If it's the O blood type in America, for example, that actually cuts out, and you're talking about an African American person, that cuts out roughly 90% of the African American population. Whereas if you're talking about a white population or a Caucasian population, that cuts out roughly, I think it's closer to 70%, and so forth. So there's a bit of variation there. It's quite useful. Sometimes it's really useful. Sometimes it's got limited use. So let's talk about BTK. This was something he left in several notes to the police. He was actually taunting the police and communicating with notes. And something you see serial killers do in movies. This is the guy who started that. So BTK, or Dennis Rader. He was the father of 2. He's a scout leader, husband, really active in his church, and an active serial killer for roughly 25 years. He murdered 10 people between 1974 and 1991 in Wichita, Kansas, which had a population at the time of roughly 270,000. Now that's 10 people. That's a scary part of that population. It really scared people. And he had the nickname BTK, bind, torture, and kill. And this was something that he got a nickname he kind of gave himself by when he was communicating to the police. He used to leave notes in. Started off with, he was leaving notes in books in the library and calling the library, and they go get it and they take note to the police. Evidence left at the scene of the crimes was never blood, but there was semen and saliva there. And Dennis Rader was a non-secretor. In other words, they couldn't even tell what blood type this guy was. So the bodily fluids he left there weren't very useful. And yeah, as we said, he spent years sending them creepy coded messages and poetry and talking to news organizations and so forth. Not so much that, but a little bit. So Dennis Rader, The semen evidence was collected, but the good thing is it was stored under appropriate conditions for nearly 30 years. When he became a suspect because he was, he got caught in the most anticlimactic way, and you really should read about him. In the early 2000s, when he became a suspect in the early 2000s, his DNA was tested against the DNA found at the scenes of the crime. What's more interesting is his DNA was actually obtained from a sample of his daughter's DNA when she gave birth at a university hospital. Because she gave birth at a university hospital, they collect this information on you and put it on a database. His DNA was able to be tested against hers to identify him as BTK. It was collected under a warrant and without his knowledge. So that's actually quite interesting. So the police were able to get a warrant and without his knowledge. And it was used to urge a detailed confession from him. Because they did that, he was then sentenced. He was basically described by his family and friends and colleagues as a nice, regular guy who is now serving 175 years. He would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for changes in forensic technology. I hope that made a lot of sense. If you didn't have any questions, put them in the comment section below, and we'll get back to you as quick as we can. Thanks for watching. Bye now.